The destroyers of the earth, in Revelation 11:18. Who are they? Revelation 11:18 is a verse that is commonly cited specifically in connection with caring for the earth and its natural resources. This paper will argue that in its appropriate context, the destruction of the earth to which Revelation 11:18 refers is not the degradation of the natural environment of the earth. Rather, it refers to the outpouring of the 7 plagues, for which ultimate responsibility, although it is God's action, is attributed to the nations under the leadership of the beast. It is therefore exegetically inappropriate to use Revelation 11:18 as a decontextualized proof text to urge environmental responsibility. Revelation 11:18 is a verse that has been popularly used in some interesting contexts that were probably not in mind when the words were written. As an example, Jones writes in his commentary that this verse has reference to the destroying of those who will be destroying this earth with nuclear weapons and high-powered explosives when Christ returns to earth. Similarly, Miller comments that we have the capacity to destroy ecosystems on a global scale. Our scientific belief in this horrific potential parallels the biblical judgment that the destroyers of the earth themselves will be destroyed. An even more popular application of this verse has to do with caring for the natural environment, so that the destroyers of the earth were understood to be those who are responsible for the degradation of the earth's natural resources. To what extent are these applications of Revelation 11:18 justified? This essay will argue that the destruction of the earth to which Revelation 11:18 refers is not specifically the degradation of the earth's natural environment. Rather, it refers to the outpouring of the 7 plagues, for which ultimate responsibility, although they are the action of God, is attributed to the nations of the earth under the leadership of the beast. Because those nations have morally destroyed the earth, God will physically destroy the earth through the 7 plagues. The general context of the statement within Revelation. The verse in question states that the nations raged, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, and for rewarding your servants, the prophets and saints, and those who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth. These words are proclaimed by the 24 elders in heaven, who fall on their faces and worship God at the end of the narrative of the 2 witnesses, Revelation 11:15-16, and before the vision of the woman and the dragon in Revelation 12. This passage about the destroyers of the earth occurs in one of the 7 heaven sanctuary scenes in the Apocalypse of John, which seem to be used in the text to mark off natural sense units. We may extrapolate that this heaven sanctuary scene encapsulates the outcome of the preceding narrative as well as providing a foretaste of what is to follow thematically. The statement about the destroyers of the earth is therefore best understood by analyzing the context of the preceding and following narratives. The comment about the destroyers of the earth occurs within the trumpet sequence in Revelation, which is particularly associated with the theophany of judgment. In fact, Paulian observes that the 7th trumpet explicitly uses the word judgment as part of the climax of the 7-fold series Revelation 11:18. The 24 elders make their statement about the destroyers of the earth, specifically in response to the sounding of the 7th angel's trumpet, verse 15. This 7th trumpet occurs at the end of and in response to the account of the 2 witnesses, which includes their testimony, their treatment at the hands of the beast from the bottomless pit and the people of the earth, and finally their rescue by God. The sounding of the 7th trumpet heralds the second coming of Jesus, and is therefore associated not only with the events that transpire immediately preceding this event, but also with the return of Jesus which follows. The purpose of the 7th trumpet is to announce that the everlasting reign of Christ has commenced upon the earth, that the rulers of the earth are about to be overthrown, and that sin will be vanquished forever. At the most general level, the sounding of the 7th trumpet encompasses the events described in Revelation 13-19, which are foreshadowed by the declaration in 11, 15, 18, 10. This provides a broad context for understanding the identity of the destroyers of the earth, and the declaration of the 24 elders. The preceding specific context of the statement in Revelation 11. In Revelation 11:18, there are several groups mentioned. 1. The nations. 2. Your God's wrath. 3. The dead who must be judged. 4. Your servants, the prophets and saints, and those who fear your name, both small and great. 5. The destroyers of the earth. As noted above, this statement comes at the culmination of the narrative of the 2 witnesses. Each of these groups just listed is a significant protagonist in the narrative. 1. The nations appear in verse 2 feet and in verse 9 inches. The specific nations of Sodom and Egypt are mentioned in verse 8. 2. God and his wrath appear in verse 5 to 6. In verse 5, the wrath of God is directed against those who would harm the two witnesses. In verse 6, the wrath is expressed in terms of the ability of the two witnesses to bring drought, to turn the waters into blood, and to strike the earth with every kind of plague. 3. The righteous dead who must be judged are found in verse 7 to 10. Here they are judged by the nations and by those who dwell on the earth, as worthy of death. In verse 11, God judges them as worthy of life. In verse 13, 7,000 are killed by an earthquake. The use of the number 7,000 suggests that these are followers of God. And this may be understood as one of the significant allusions to the Elijah narrative in this account. This symbolic number appears to refer to servants of God who in this case have been killed by the powers of evil. The dead who must be judged in the account of the two witnesses are the righteous dead. They must be judged so that they may be vindicated and receive their reward. This is supported by the construction of verse 18, which displays significant chiastic parallelisms that may be represented in this manner. A. Zai. The nations were angry. B. Zai, and your wrath has come. C. Zai. The time has come for judging the dead. D. Zai, and for rewarding your servants the prophets and saints. C2. Zai, and your people who revere your name, both great and small. B2. Zai, and for destroying. A2. Those who destroy the earth. 12. The instances of Zai in B1, B2 should therefore not be seen as conjunctive in a pure syntactic sense, in other words as merely joining loosely related clauses. Rather, they may be best seen as 13 conjoining expressions. This suggested structure brings several salient points to light. First of all, the focus of this statement is on rewarding the servants of God. Secondly, the dead who are to be judged are these same servants of God. Thirdly, the destruction of those who destroy the earth is a function of the wrath of God, and the counterpoint to God's judgment of the righteous dead. Fourthly and finally, this suggested structure points to the identity and character of the destroyers of the earth, since they are parallel to the nations who are angry at the servants of God and at the work of God on their behalf. Revelation 11:18 therefore refers to the coming of the wrath of God against those who have mistreated and pronounced an unrighteous judgment against his servants. The divine righteous judgment of the servants of God also implies the consequences for their oppressors, the destroyers of the earth. They receive the same verdict that they pronounced against God's servants, that is, their own destruction. 4. The servants, prophets, and saints of God, and those who fear his name, are thematically central to the narrative of Revelation 11. The two witnesses are called prophets, verse 10. The number 2 is repeated several times in the narrative. There are 2 witnesses, 2 olive trees, and 2 lampstands, verse 4. This suggests the need to interpret the number 2 symbolically in this passage, rather than referring to 2 discrete persons or entities. The symbolism of the number 2 particularly points to the concept of witness. Verse 15. Therefore, in this narrative the 2 witnesses appear to symbolize, at some level, the broader number of the servants of God, in contrast to those who oppose the will of God. 5. Now we turn to the destroyers of the earth. The notion of the destruction of the earth is evident in the narrative in the fire from the mouth of the 2 witnesses, verse 5. The power to shut the sky, verse 6. The turning of the waters into blood, verse 6, and the striking of the earth with plagues, verse 6. The allusions in verse 6b are clearly to Moses and the plagues on Egypt. More broadly, fire, drought, and plague were part of a common repertoire of apocalyptic disasters. Others included war, famine, and earthquakes. 16. These events were not only seen as destroying communities, but were also specifically associated with the end of the world. Although in Revelation 11, the means by which the destroyers of the earth destroy the earth is not specified, the anger of the nations in rebellion against God and his servants is clearly associated with the destruction of the earth, as per A1 and A2 in the structure above. Although it is God who sends fire, drought, and plagues, both to protect his servants and to punish their persecutors, Revelation 11:5 makes it clear that these plagues are conditional on the witnesses being harmed. In other words, the responsibility for these lies with those who would harm God's servants. We can therefore observe that the statement of the 24 elders in 11:18 is based on the preceding narrative of the 2 witnesses. By analyzing and comparing the protagonists in verse 18, we can confirm that they are to be identified with the protagonists in the account of the two witnesses. The structure of verse 18 itself leads us to the conclusion that the destroyers of the earth are the nations in rebellion against God, and that they are responsible for destroying the earth through their opposition to God and to his servants. Although the responsibility lies with the nations, ultimate accountability lies with God, who executes judgment. This conclusion is confirmed by a consideration of the broader structure of the narrative preceding Revelation 11, for which again, a chiastic structure is proposed, the two witnesses chiasm, Revelation 10:11. Revelation 11:18. In this structure, Revelation 11:18 corresponds to Revelation 10:11. In this latter verse, there are two groups of characters, firstly the prophets, and secondly, the peoples, nations, languages and kings. This second group may be equated with those who dwell on the earth, in Revelation 11:10. Indeed, verse 10 makes clear that the conflict in Revelation 11 is between the prophets and those who dwell on the earth. In killing the two witnesses, the beast from the bottomless pit is acting in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants of the earth. Because of the similarities between Revelation 11:18 and 10:11, we may again assert that the destroyers of the earth corresponds to the peoples, nations, languages and kings, who act against God's revealed will is given through his prophets. So far, we have interpreted the statement in 11:18, in the light of its antecedent and of the narrative unit of which it forms a part. Our basis is that the declaration of the 24 elders is part of a sanctuary heaven scene that summarizes or draws together the lessons from what has gone before. However, these scenes also foreshadow what is to come in the narrative. Accordingly, it is also instructive to examine 11:18 in the light of what follows in the book of Revelation. The subsequent general context of the statement in Revelation, firstly, Revelation 11:15, makes it clear that the destroyers of the earth are to be understood in the context of the kingdom of the world, becoming the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and of the proclamation of his everlasting reign. This is further described in Revelation 17, where the kings of the earth who hand over their power and authority to the beast, verse 13, and make war on the Lamb, were in turn conquered by the Lamb, verse 14. In this and related passages, the kings of the earth and their overthrow were explicitly associated with the beast and his destruction. The destroyers of the earth were also connected with the time for rewarding your servants, the prophets and saints, and those who fear your name, 11:18. This phrase is somewhat paralleled by Revelation 18:24, where it is stated that in Babylon was found the blood of prophets and of saints, and of all who have been slain on earth. The saints and prophets appear also in 16:6. It appears that when the saints and the prophets are mentioned together in Revelation, it is in the context of martyrdom. This should inform us of the nature of the destruction wreaked by God's enemies in the same verse, as well as the nature of the reward, which the 24 elders declare that they are to receive in 11:18. In 19:2, although the words saints and prophets are not used, the servants of God are mentioned. This provides a parallel with 11:18, where is used to refer collectively to God's prophets and saints. In this verse, 19:2, we are told that God has judged the great prostitute who corrupted the earth with her immorality, and has avenged on her the blood of his servants. The connection between 19:2 and 11:18 is notably strengthened because the 24 elders, last seen worshiping God in 11:16, are presented as falling on their faces and worshiping God in 19:4. When the declaration of God is made concerning the avenging of the blood of God's servants on the great prostitute. In the context of the martyrdom of the two witnesses, the time for rewarding your servants, the prophets, and saints, should therefore be understood principally as a reference to the martyrs. Indeed, it is the beast and its ally Babylon who are held accountable for the blood of prophets and of saints, and of all who have been slain on earth. 18. It is therefore in response to the pouring out of the 7 plagues, that the voice of the great multitude in heaven is heard to proclaim, Hallelujah! Salvation and glory and power belong to our God, for his judgments are true and just, for he has judged the great prostitute who corrupted the earth with her immorality, and has avenged on her the blood of his servants. Revelation 19:1-2. In the statement of the 24 elders, the destroyers of the earth were also connected with the time in which the wrath of God is manifested. Subsequently in the book of Revelation, the notion of the manifestation of the wrath of God is specifically focused on the description of the 7 plagues in Revelation 15:1-5-16, 17. We read that in the 7 plagues, the wrath of God is finished. This is to be compared with the declaration in 11:18, that God's wrath has come. The 7 plagues are specifically associated with the beast 21 and his followers as the recipients of the plagues. The time of the judgment of the dead should be particularly understood in terms of the description given in Revelation 20. Satan will come out to deceive the nations that are at the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, but fire came down from heaven and consumed them, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet where the dead were judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. Verse 7, 10, 12. This passage in Revelation 20 should furthermore be paralleled with the description in Revelation 19, 19-20, and I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who was sitting on the horse and against his army. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet. These 2 were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. Ultimately, the time for rewarding God's servants is the time of the judgment of the dead that is described in these passages, both in terms of the righteous dead receiving their rewards, as well as in terms of their vindication through the condemnation of the beast and the nations of the earth. In verse 12, the book of life is specifically mentioned as being opened. This is significant, because while the lake of fire and the second death are mentioned in verse 10, 14-15, it should not be forgotten that Revelation 21, 1-27 is devoted to the rewards for God's servants. In the text of Revelation after chapter 11, it is evident that it is the beast that is at the heart of antagonism against God, precisely as it is the beast from the bottomless pit, Revelation 11, 7. That is the antagonist of God in the account of the 2 witnesses. Just as the beast makes war on and slays the 2 witnesses, so too the beast is the great persecuting power in the subsequent chapters of Revelation. It is the beast, Babylon, and the nations who follow them who are responsible for the destruction of the earth, through their opposition to God and their moral corruption of the earth. In God's economy, He Himself delivers the 7 plagues upon the earth, the destruction for which the enemies of God are ultimately responsible. Lus talionis and the identification of the destroyers of the earth. The legal principle of lus talionis is found across many cultures of the ancient world. It is not merely a Jewish notion. 22. However, the idea was also common in Second Temple Judaism 23 and early Christianity. David Feenzi, for example, has demonstrated that the Jewish notion of lex talionis is used to structure the Apocalypse of Peter. Each punishment corresponds to each vice, so that the punishment fits the crime, like repays like 24. Brower notes 4 direct mentions of the talio in the New Testament. 25. However, in addition to the instances he provides, it is clear that Revelation also explicitly refers to the lus talionis. Certainly, Revelation 11:18 is an application of this principle, about which Richard Bauckham comments, this is an example of the eschatological lus talionis, a way of speaking of God's eschatological judgment in which the description of the punishment matches verbally the description of the sin. In this case, the verbal correspondence is achieved by the use of a Greek verb diaphtero, which can mean both destroy, in the sense of causing to perish, and ruin, in the sense of corrupting with evil. 26. In this regard, the chiastic structure proposed above should be borne in mind. The principle of ius talionis applies in terms of Revelation 11:18. Being the capstone summary statement encapsulating the judicial issues involved in the narrative of the 2 witnesses. If we see the narrative of the 2 witnesses as foreshadowing the key themes of Revelation 13-19, then we may correspondingly see the statement of the 24 elders in 11:16-18. As anticipating these later chapters of Revelation, together with the embedded theme of lus talionis. This is indeed the case, both structurally and explicitly. As an example, the parallelism in the judgment against the beast out of the sea in 13:10 may be shown. If anyone is to be taken captive to captivity he goes, if anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. It is notable that when the 7 plagues are described as being poured out in Revelation, a specific justification is only provided for the 3rd plague, that of the waters being turned into blood. Therefore, when the third angel pours out his bowl into the waters, and they became blood, the angel in charge of the waters says, "Just are you, O Holy One, who is and who was, for you brought these judgments. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. It is what they deserve." Revelation 16, 5-6. That this is the only plague for which a justification is specifically given highlights the significance of the martyrdom theme in this context. The connection with Revelation 11 should also not be missed here, not only in terms of the general notion of lus talionis, but also because in chapter 11, it is the two witnesses who have the power to turn water into blood, verse 6. Furthermore, it is the two witnesses who are killed, 11:7. The connection between chapters 11 and 16 is even more dramatic in terms of how the description of the pouring out of the final plagues is structured. In Revelation 11:6, we are told that the two witnesses have the power to strike the earth with every kind of plague. The three plagues which are threatened for those who harm the two witnesses in Revelation 11, which then exist only in eschatological potential, are poured out in reality in Revelation 16, as may be observed in the following comparison. Revelation 11. Condition unfulfilled. If anyone would harm them. Verse 5. Fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. Verse 5. They have the power to shut the sky, that no rain may fall. Verse 6. They have power over the waters to turn them into blood. Verse 6. Revelation 16. Condition fulfilled, for they have shed the blood of saints and prophets. Verse 6. The fourth angel poured out his bowl on the sun, and it was allowed to scorch people with fire. They were scorched by the fierce heat. Verse 8 and 9. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up. Verse 12. The second angel poured out his bowl into the sea, and it became like the blood of a corpse. The third angel poured out his bowl into the rivers and the springs of water, and they became blood. Verse 3-4. These plagues specifically and respectively demonstrate the power of God over fire, water, and blood. This is no coincidence, since these three elements are central to the sacrificial system of the Old Testament and to the concept of cleansing throughout the canonical scriptures 27. In this sense, Revelation 11 should be understood as providing an anticipatory foretaste of what is to come. The narrative of the two witnesses culminates in the declaration of 11:18. As a key statement that anticipates the outpouring of the judgments of God. If we are to properly identify the destroyers of the earth, we must take note both upon whom the wrath of God is poured out, and the reason for these judgments. The wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture, 14-8, is drunk by Babylon and those who worship the beast and his image, 14-9. These correspond to the beast and to the nations that follow it in Revelation 11. The reasons they must receive these plagues are described in Revelation 14, as being spiritual fornication, verse 8, and false worship, verse 9, which have resulted in their persecution and killing of the saints, and the prophets 19-6. Bauckham picks up this notion of Lo-Ovia by noting that in Revelation 19-2, it is Babylon, the great prostitute who corrupted the earth with her immorality. The word translated here as corrupted is the same root word used for destroyers in 11:18. For that reason, Bauckham also rightly remarks that the destroyers of the earth are the powers of evil, the dragon, the beast, and the harlot of Babylon. It is to be noted that in Revelation 19-2, the accountability for the execution of this judgment is clearly attributed to the great prostitute. However, God himself takes responsibility for executing the judgment. The nature of the destruction of the earth Richard Bauckham highlights an allusion to the Genesis flood story in Revelation 11-18. The extent to which the Creator's faithfulness to his creation is the theme of Revelation can be appreciated if we notice a significant allusion to the Genesis flood story in Revelation 11:18. The phrase, for destroying the destroyers of the earth, also alludes to the equivalent wordplay in Genesis 6:11-13, 17, where the Hebrew verb, nn, has the same double meaning, 29. If this allusion is correct, in what sense is the earth said to be corrupt, in Genesis 6? It has been corrupted by the wickedness and evil of humanity, Genesis 6:5. The word used for corrupt in the LXX of Genesis 6:11 is Q0io, the same root word that is used for destroy in Revelation 11:18. Genesis 6:11 states that the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence, and this is rendered in the LXX as ponda yn anantion tu theo kai eplest hige adikias. The Hebrew wordplay in Genesis 6:11-13 is therefore preserved in the LXX, which in turn also strongly emphasizes the semantic connection with Revelation 11:18. This should help us to understand the meaning of 11:18, as it would have been understood by its first recipients. In both Genesis 6:11 and Revelation 11:18, we have the corruption of the earth expressed with the same words, together with the concept of violence. In Genesis 6, the word is being used in two senses, firstly in humanity's corruption of the earth, 6:11, and secondly in God's destruction of the earth, verse 13. We might say that God destroys the earth, because humanity has already destroyed it with its wickedness. The same wordplay between the two meanings of kosio, to corrupt, and to destroy, may be understood in Revelation 11:18. God destroys the destroyers of the earth because they have destroyed the earth through their evil, wickedness, and violence. Within this context, it is again reasonable to make a distinction in Revelation 11:18 between the accountability for the destruction, which is borne by the nations, and the judicial execution of justice, a responsibility that is assumed by God. If there is a reasonable connection between Genesis 6:11-13 and Revelation 11:18, then this should help us to understand the nature of the destruction wreaked by the destroyers of the earth. If the parallel holds with Genesis 6:11-13, then the destroyers of the earth must be said to have destroyed the earth through their evil and wickedness. It is not principally a literal and physical destruction, rather it is principally a moral destruction. To be even more specific, Revelation 11:18, when understood in its context, says the destroyers have destroyed the earth through their violence against the servants of God, the prophets and the saints. However, Stefanovic remarks on a stronger and perhaps more pertinent allusion in Revelation 11:18 to Jeremiah 51:25, where God declares, "Behold, I am against you, O destroying mountain, declares the Lord, which destroys the whole earth. Diak o epsilon tav el au and th nu yif, LXX." Revelation 11:18 parallels key aspects of this passage. In Jeremiah, God makes his declaration specifically in the context of the fall of Babylon, verse 8. God will stir up the spirit of a destroyer against Babylon, verse 1. God here attributes the responsibility for the destruction, or the fall, of Babylon, to her own sins, verse 47, 52-53, and crimes. In particular, God declares that Babylon must fall for the slain of Israel, just as for Babylon have fallen the slain of all the earth. Jeremiah 51:49. In other words, the destruction of Babylon is specifically because of her destruction of the people of God, and more broadly because she is held responsible for the slain of all the earth. For these reasons, destroyers will come from the Lord against Babylon, to execute judgment against her, and the Lord will lay Babylon waste, verse 54, because the Lord is a God of recompense, and he will surely repay, verse 56. It is apparent that there are clear parallels between this passage and the themes of Revelation concerning the enemies of God, and their judicial destruction by God. Specifically, in the LXX, the word used for destroying is the same root word as in Revelation 11:18, and Revelation 19:234. Stefanovic notes the connections between Revelation 11:18 and what follows in the book of Revelation, writing that the destruction of the destroyers of the earth in Revelation 11:18 is a clear reference to the end-time Babylon described in Revelation 19:2 as corrupting or destroying the earth with immorality, which is a further reference to Revelation 17:1-6. As we have noted, the reference in 11:18 to the destruction by God is best understood in the context of the 7 plagues. Therefore, the recipients of the plagues must be identified with the destroyers of the earth, that is, the beast and its false system, including Babylon, the kings of the earth, and all those who worship the beast. In the narrative of Revelation 11, the inhabitants of the earth rejoice and celebrate the action of the beast against the 2 witnesses, verse 10. We must observe that there are notable parallels between the persecuting function of the beast in Revelation 11, and the beasts of Revelation 13. Indeed, there are significant inverted parallels, so that the beast that arises out of the earth may be seen as the evil mirror of the two witnesses, both in the mention of the fire, cf. Revelation 11:5, and in the revival of the first beast, cf. Revelation 11:11. The key concept here is that in Revelation 11, although God is the Lord of the earth, Revelation 11:4, the earth has become so corrupted under the leadership of the beast that its inhabitants are arrayed against God and his witnesses. This is indeed also the idea in Revelation 13, so that the beast that arises out of the earth makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, verse 12, and deceives those who dwell on earth, verse 14, imposing its mark upon all, verse 16. This is followed in chapter 15, by a warning against the beast and the reception of his mark, Revelation 14:9. And a call to worship the true God, Revelation 14:6-7. The consequence of the earth's failure to respond to these warnings is found in Revelation 15-16 with the pouring out of the 7 plagues. The phrase, destroying the destroyers of the earth, must be understood in the context of the narrative with which it is connected, in relation to the wrath of God, and in terms of the broader structure of Revelation 11-20. When this is done, it is evident that it is exegetically inappropriate to use Revelation 11:18 to urge environmental responsibility. A correct understanding of this text in its context reveals it to be referring to the moral destruction of the world generally, and to the persecution and martyrdom of God's messengers specifically. God's response will be to pour out the 7 plagues, according to the principle of lus talionis. While environmental irresponsibility may be understood as being subsumed by the issues of morality, and rebellion against God in a theological sense, it is not the primary concern of this text. In spite of this, Revelation 11:18 continues to be an ever-ready and popular weapon with which to combat those who are perceived to be destroying the natural environment. We may certainly affirm that God is passionately concerned for what he has created and works to affirm his creation against those who destroy it. However, the way in which Revelation 11:18 has been popularly used in the past has been misleading. There are many other ways in which we may appropriately affirm from Scripture our responsibility to care for creation, and we should avoid using Revelation 11:18 as a principal proof text for this purpose. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.